Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists in first name order to introduce themselves by telling us your host country, year of service, your current title versus what you actually do, and how Peace Corps prepared you to work in your current role. Feel free to pick and choose from that menu. So Razak, I know you're an R, but we're gonna start with you, okay?
Got it, we're doing government names. All right, hi, my name is Razak. I served in Comoros from 2015 to 2017. My current title on paper is a program manager. What I really do is actually grant management, and I've been transitioning, with air quotes, to a program officer role since, I want to say, April of this year, but the virus has slowed down. So I've just been focused on a lot of emergency assistance and cash assistance needs for the nonprofits all over the city. With that, I work at Robin Hood Foundation. It's a foundation based in New York that essentially just supports nonprofits working to reduce poverty amongst New Yorkers. And I think I'll stop there for now. I'm unable to answer the other question for the moment. Thank you.
Liz?
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz Ogunwo, and I served in Senegal in 2010 to 2012. I currently serve as a program director for the National Basketball Players Association Foundation. Sorry about that. And on paper, that is overseeing our grant management portfolio and our array of programmatic efforts. In real life, this is a lot of communication, a lot of talking with various stakeholders, a lot of pivoting work, and being attuned to what's going on in current events, and how do we show up in that work. The National Basketball Players Association Foundation is the foundation affiliated with the union that represents all 450 active basketball players, and we support these basketball players in their community efforts off the court.
Awesome, thank you. Lenny?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lenny Vasquez. I work at, I was an economic development volunteer in Peru from 2013 to 15. Economic development, community economic development, small business, business development, many names for it. And now I'm currently at the City Foundation, so Citigroup, like Citibank's corporate foundation, on the grants management team. So doing all kinds of grants management stuff in terms of, operational due diligence, compliance, that kind of thing, as well as board governance. So I'm the person, kind of the point person for the 3 board meetings that we'll have a year, as well as any other, approvals that we require from the board. And was there another question? I'm blanking. How did Peace Corps prepare me for this role? Many ways. I would say flexibility was one of the strongest ways. The City Foundation's mission is to promote economic progress, and so a lot of the programs that we are funding or that we are supporting, I have experience with, right, by very nature of my Peace Corps service. So that was also really interesting, and something I very heavily talked about in the interviews.
And Maggie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Liu. I served in St. Kitts and Nevis on the island of Nevis 2009 to 2011 as a youth and community development volunteer. I currently work at Girl Up, which is an initiative of the United Nations Foundation. We are a global girls empowerment initiative with 4,000 Girl Up clubs in 125 countries. So our main priority is to develop girls' leadership skills, and specific to my job, I work on M&E and program management, which helps us really implement programs, but also track their progress throughout their leadership index. On paper, I'm a manager, but honestly, I'm 2 employees shy of running the entire programs team, so I think I'm a director. So outside of that, I also am one of the co-leaders of the very first Asian and Pacific Islander affinity group at UNF, which started in 2019, which is crazy. How is that the first Asian and Pacific Islander affinity group? So I'm running that with a very good colleague of mine. I'm also an RPCVW board member, and I've also been with the New York City Peace Corps Association. And I think the Peace Corps taught me diplomacy, but I definitely lose it at times.
Hilarious. Okay, Carlia.
That's great. Thank all the panelists for sharing. I really liked how you guys told us what you do on paper and what you actually do. It's great to see the difference. So I'm just going to go say a few ground rules. If you can, please mute yourself while others are speaking, because sometimes there's a lot of background noise going on and sometimes you don't know it. So that'll be helpful to limit distractions. And sometimes the video lags. So give it a couple of seconds before you jump in. And definitely, I know that hopefully the weather holds up, but if it does start storming, we will have some internet connection issues. So please bear with us. And also, everyone feel free to use the chat box while others are speaking. And we're going to have a 35-minute Q&A, moderator Q&A session, but we're also going to have a 35-minute audience Q&A session. And so you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. And we ask that if you do want to ask a question, you type it in the chat with the word question, and then say your question afterward, type question in all caps, and we will try to answer your questions during the audience Q&A session. And also please remember that this is an intentional space for everyone to feel heard, acknowledged, and supported. We are here for each other during this time, and we definitely know that there's a lot going on. Please feel free to reach out to us if you need support. And additionally, this is a safe and brave space. Safe space for everyone to kind of say their opinion and have a discussion. We do want this to be include audience participation, and also a brave space, because I know that we're going to be there are going to be a lot of vulnerable moments. The panelists and the audience members are going to be telling their truth and really sharing with us. So we want this to be a safe and brave space, and we ask that everyone be respectful and just be open to listening to a different perspective than your own, and listen deeply and feel free to participate. And Jamila?
Thank you. So the format that we have for moderated questions is that we're going to ask one question to each panelist, and if other panelists want to respond, they will feel free to do so, and we're going to try to keep it to about 5 minutes per question. So the first one is, what does diversity mean to you? And Lenny, I'm going to throw that question to you, and then other people can chime in as they see fit.
All right, plunging right in, I guess. So it's an interesting question. I think diversity at the end of the day, and so I kind of learned this definition from somebody else. So I recently co-founded a DEI working group at my job with several other colleagues that kind of expanded. And so now there are a couple different DEI working groups that I'm on. But one of them, we were having a meeting and we were talking about, our mission, our objectives, our goals, everything like that, et cetera. And this gentleman kind of laid it out very nicely. And so DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, can be thought of in very simple terms. Diversity is who is invited to the party. Equity is who is dancing at the party. And inclusion is who can change the music at the party. And I think that's a really great way of looking at this kind of topic, because it can get so convoluted, right? And then everybody can come in with their own perspectives or their own views. And so things can get lost in all of that noise, right? And so I think at the very minimum, diversity is just looking around you and seeing who and what are at the table, right? So who's there, who's showing up, who's, not necessarily is everyone showing up in the same way, not necessarily is everyone, get to the pie or an equitable piece of the pie. It's who's there at the very bare minimum. And I think that, the top three are the top three in my experience are usually race, gender, and sexuality. But diversity is really so much more beyond that, right? I think now, especially, I've been thinking of a couple of identities that I have, which is employed, thankfully, and childless, also thankfully, right? And so I think there's so many different dimensions to this idea of diversity. And I think at the bare minimum, it's just who's there, right? Who's shown up, who's coming to the party, who's at the party. So that's what I would say diversity means to me.
I love that, and it's so easy to remember. That's really great. Who else wants to? Maggie?
I would love to jump in. Lenny, I love your DJ dancing. This is like a nightclub party scene, but it really does make a lot of sense to me because, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, do we have space for all sorts of different dance circles? You know, can we make a Congo line with different people in it? And it's just, I think diversity is really just having the space for people to express both their given and chosen identities and to be able to practice their beliefs, you know, dance the way they want to. And I really like that you brought in the intersectionality. You know, we don't just identify as one. A lot of us have multiple identities in us. And now I'm really starting to see a lot of, especially at UNF, a lot of cross participation across affinity groups because we do identify with more than one a lot of the times. And I've also been noticing a shift in the conversation at UNF. It's not just about DEI, but also looking at power and privilege. And it's not just inclusion, but it's people of power sharing that power and using that power to be advocates.
Anybody else?
Great. Thank y'all for sharing. That was deep. We're gonna do a quick poll. Real quick, we're gonna give everyone about 60 seconds to do the polling. So please take a look, vote. Okay, maybe 30 seconds. 60 seconds is a little long. Okay, so right now, the results of the poll, what would you say your workplace supports diversity? 46% said yes, 8% said no, and 46% said sometimes. It's really interesting. I'd like to learn about the sometimes. And also, why not, right? Like, why doesn't an organization workplace support diversity? There's definitely a lot of room for growth. We're gonna go on to the second question. That is, what identities, seen or unseen, do you claim, and why is diversity in your field important? Who wants to start us off?
I guess I can, if that's all right. First of all, thank you for putting this together, but more importantly, for just holding this space. And I want to just go back to Lenny's coworker's DJ analogy, the club. And if you walk into that club, and in my case, the club is Robin Hood, what identity, seen or unseen, that I claim, seen are definitely what's on the outside. Black male, presumably cisgender, presumably straight. And that is how I'm seen. Therefore, I'm received in that way. Unseen, Muslim, unlike my sisters, my siblings, my friends who are Muslim, who are women, they wear hijabs. So that is more of a seen public, and for me, unless you understand the root of my name, you're not going to assume I'm Muslim. So those are probably the main. It's what I look like physically on the outside. Now, what I try to make seen, and I think this is important, is my accolades, my merits. And whether I do that consciously or unconsciously, I notice that connecting to why diversity is important in my field is this is a very powerful field. Philanthropy is unchecked money. That's a reality. And there are calls to keep it more responsible. But I want to connect this to something Bill Gates said a few years back when somebody asked him about whether or not he'd be interested in running for presidency and he plainly said, honestly, I have more power running the Gates Foundation, where my power and my interests politically are unchecked, than I do in any way, shape, or form as a public servant. And I think that's why diversity is really important. Diversity is important because just like for me, my favorite analogy about diversity is an ecosystem. You know, no matter how annoying a bee might be or how annoying a mosquito might be, you know, I'm trying to think of very annoying insects that people may or may not like. They're extremely important to the diversity of an ecosystem, therefore the sustainability of an ecosystem. And that's how I relate to the concept of diversity inside and outside the workplace on a personal level and in a systemic level. I think we are all human, we're all fallible, so it is impossible to cover all bases without having numerous voices in a room helping make decisions. And that is not the case in philanthropy. It is still a predominantly white field. And until that changes, a lot of the social changes that philanthropy talks about are not going to be met. One of my favorite professors who talks about philanthropy, her name is Megan Ming Francis. And she talks a lot about these concepts of movement capture. And we can get into that deeper, but it's essentially this idea that, you know, although philanthropies like my own, Robin Hood, and every other philanthropy try to support systemic change the same way they're doing right now, they are not bringing in the decision makers who have the lived experience and instead consult and tend to shift it. And a perfect example is the NAACP and how they changed over time because of the Ford Foundation. And I think Rockefeller was funding the Black Panther movement until the Black Panther movement started to talk about self-defense and self-reliance. And then that's when they pulled out. So that is something that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to why diversity is important.
Excellent. I guess I can jump into, I think, similar to the way that you had laid it out as well, too, like in terms of seeing Black, cis female, if you can recognize my last name, some lineage to Nigeria. And then in terms of unseen, like bringing my accolades to the work. But as I'm hearing you talk, I know every day I don't take for granted where I work and who I work for. In terms of who I work for are over 450 basketball players who are from around the world. I think people don't realize that a quarter of the league is international. And as you're working with these players and supporting their philanthropic efforts, it pulls out the diversity so that you're able to form a common ground, whether it is you know, being born and raised in a southern state, Virginia, whether it is you spent time in the Peace Corps for a couple of years, and you can speak to two of the players who are from Senegal and Wolof, and you can speak to their moms as they're, you know, trying to build out their food security efforts in Kébémer, Senegal. So the workspace where I'm in, it clings to diversity and connectedness in terms of moving community efforts forward in support of our players. I think the work that they do is so critical and important because they come from the communities where they're supporting. They're bringing their lived experience to their work and how they're choosing to invest philanthropic dollars into this community. So when you're talking about who's at the table in the power dynamics, those are those community members because they have that rapport and they have that relationship. And I think it is very critical for traditional philanthropy to see these players as philanthropists and also recognize effective philanthropy. I think it goes back to our lived experience as Peace Corps volunteers, just the notion of coming in and, it's right. And let's just, we got the money. So this is the way things could go. We have the strategies and the plans to make your communities better, but that really isn't the case. It's just every day urging traditional philanthropy to recognize how critical it is to have the right people at the table making these decisions.
I think that's a really great arc back maybe to what Razak you brought up about movement capture. We have a question for clarification around that. Do you want to just give that a couple minutes?
Sure. I'm sorry, I must have lost the question.
I think it's just to get like a working definition of what
Got
movement.
it. Okay. Okay. So I shared an article on there. Feel free, that'll give more context in the future. But essentially, the concept of movement capture is something that Anand Giridhar also talks about. And by the way, all of this knowledge, and I want to clarify, all of this knowledge was started and spoken about by Black nonprofit leaders, women mainly, community organizers, since like the 1990s. So none of what I'm saying is new. It's just coming back because, let's be fair, a Harvard professor named Megan brought it up again, and her research, and Isabel Sahel. And these are women who are not Black. One of them is a POC and another is a white woman. And I say that because a lot of these things we're talking about, none of them are new. Movement capture is as old as philanthropy. And the concept is simple. If you're a philanthropist, you are going to give just enough, if you're a foundation, just enough to kind of keep society at a status quo. And that's the reality of philanthropy. That is the reality, whether that is a stated goal, whether that is explicit, that is a side effect of philanthropies supporting social movements, especially social justice movements. And a lot of what I've learned, at least through Megan Ming Francis's course, she has an incredible online course, by the way, and I can share that too. It's Philanthropy and Social Movements. And a lot of it is essentially a nonprofit is going to get supported by a larger philanthropy because they are going to try and help push an organization to be more mainstream, NAACP pre-1970s, or the Black Panther movement pre-1980s. And both of those are very important because they were considered radical up until they started gaining a lot more funding. And because now someone has a pocketbook, likely a rich person, who may even be affected by parts of the policies that the BLM movement, NAACP have been pushing for a while, they will, through the power of their wallet, push the NAACP's organizers and leaders and the Black Panther leaders, especially the people who are trying to garner funding, into a safer set of political demands they can make that do not affect that philanthropist or the institutions around it. So essentially, yes, we want to help you change society, but slow down. And that's a concept of movement capture.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge tension, right? Between the people who know the problems and can solve the problems, but don't necessarily have the capital. How do we protect those ideas? Yeah. Anybody else want to weigh in on this? Okay, so I'm gonna toss out another question to our panelists. What are some of the threats and opportunities you think that nonprofit organizations face in the current environment? And that could be related to COVID, it could be related to the Black Lives Matter movement, it could be related to the upcoming election, whatever you think are the threats and opportunities.
I can go ahead and start. So I think that one of the major threats that has been ongoing since the beginning of philanthropy is that we are continuing to perpetuate the white savior complex in both the United States and abroad. And even when I look around me at UNF, the worker bees, the middle management, we're really diverse in our workforce. But when you look up to leadership, it's always the same majority white people, mostly white males. And that's basically what it comes down to, because in the beginning, that's what it was led by: white men from the global north going out to different countries and saying like, oh, this is how we do it. We've done it well. And now we're going to implement some one size fits all to any country in the global south. And I feel like a lot of philanthropies or do good organizations nowadays are like, oh, we used to do that, but we don't anymore because we have DEI, we have a diverse workforce, look at the managers and the associates. And I really think that a threat for all of us is continuing to allow the brush off. You know, oh, we're not like that now. I think our role is to challenge these statements. Okay, so what were you before? So how are we not like that now? What changes have been made? And is there room for more change? And I think this is part of the cycle that really holds us back for diversity, and especially in the nonprofit environment, because we're not addressing the root of the problem and understanding that first before we have the discussions to what we need to implement to really make sustainable change.
I agree with that 100%. And I think it's interesting. I think COVID has been really obviously devastating to a lot of nonprofits. I think a lot of nonprofits that are in danger are the ones that were kind of following the advice given, which is like, you know what, don't be reliant on your donors. Don't be 100% reliant on, you know, these sources of money. Start charging fees for events, or start charging, you know, like all the like ticket sales or whatever it is. And I think that those are really going to be impacted as well during this time, right? I think right now funders have the power has shifted even more in the direction of funders and philanthropic organizations than it was previously, because we are one of the very, very few remaining income streams that are accessible to a lot of these nonprofits. I will say also, just going off what Maggie said, I agree 100%. I think especially with DEI, a lot of organizations, there's a difference, right? In DEI, there's a difference between wanting to say you're doing the work and doing the work, right? And I think a lot of times it's very easy to point to a statistic or a number or a percentage or whatever it is and say, we're getting better, we're doing the right thing. You know, we're nailing it, right? And the lived reality of the people, especially the employees in the organization, is very different. And so I think that it's absolutely, yeah, it's crucial for us to look at where we were coming from, but also where we want to go, right? Like, you know, setting these goals of, because I mean, Citigroup is obviously, you know, I work at a corporate foundation. It's different than a lot of traditional philanthropic organizations because our board, not all white men, but they're all CEOs of, you know, the CEO of Asia Pacific region, CEO of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, CEO of Latin America, right? These are all very, very wealthy, typically white, typically males, right? That are super high up in the organization. And I think that is pretty much the only lived experience that we're getting. Similar to the senior staff at the actual foundation, right? The decision makers, the people with actual power, tend to be one of a very limited amount of identities, right? White, rich, male. The president of the foundation is actually a female. You know, we have women on our senior leadership, but the perspectives, or whatever you want to call it, they're coming to the table with tend to be very uniform. And I think that really hinders a lot of our work, because I think, you know, similar to what other people have been saying, as long as there is a city group, a city bank, we will need a city foundation, right? Like, as long as these institutions and these systems are as they are, even today, like even in the midst of, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests and everything like that, I think that they're perpetuating this kind of system that requires organizations like the City Foundation and our nonprofit grantees to exist and to work, right? And so that there's that kind of systemic change that I think that we all need to be driving towards, but the decision makers, the people in power, are obviously very resistant to that, right? Because they are the system. And so I think it's, you know, I think it's very important that we look, yes, at where we were coming from and how we've been, but also where we want to go, right? And I think that a big part of that is looking internally as well. Like, yeah, we can talk about the system. Yeah, we can talk about rates of unemployment, rates of, you know, people with access to credit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we also need to be looking at the organizations as well themselves, the ones who are actually driving or wanting to drive this systemic change.
Wow. I mean, both of you just raised some phenomenal points. The only small thing that I wanted to add is just, you know, flipping over the notion of philanthropy itself, the haves having a say in discerning where money should be spread and allocated. I think during this time, direct giving and this movement towards universal basic income has, you know, come to life. And this reality of people know how to handle their money, right? They know the best way that they need to be allocating, distributing funds in order to have their basic needs met. And I definitely see that as a risk for nonprofits that are operating in this space who are used to providing like resources and support and not specifically that cash assistance too. So there's really been that reflection of why are we here? What is our purpose? And can this be done more effectively with direct cash assistance?
Yeah, definitely. It's still run on that old school idea of this amount of dollars saved this amount of people and provided this number of meals. And one thing that I've learned serving on the Grants Advisory Committee for the New York Women's Foundation is that a lot of this money that we grant unrestricted because you don't know what people need. A lot of times it's just paying the Wi-Fi bill or paying the bills to keep the lights on to do the good work. And it's not our place to come in and say, oh, this is what we think you need. They're going to tell you what they need on how they spend their money.
I 100% agree. I think we are also moving in a kind of general operating support direction. A lot of our grants are being pivoted or are being opened up to the possibility of being pivoted to general operating support, because at the end of the day, a lot of these grantees are repeat grantees. We have existing relationships with these nonprofits that we're funding. This isn't the first year we're funding them in a lot of cases. And in that sense, it's like, okay, we have this relationship and we trust this organization. So there's no reason we shouldn't be able to give them, you know, unrestricted funding, you know, a big grant for unrestricted funding for the overhead or whatever other costs that they may need to cover that, you know, we don't necessarily have to assign a programmatic function to, right? And we have this relationship. We know the people that work here. We know the work that they're doing. There's that trust that's already been built. So we need to act on that trust. We just opened up. So City Foundation's grant process is invitation only. So we don't accept any unsolicited applications or anything, with a couple of exceptions. And one of them actually is going on right now. Well, it just closed, but we just launched an open RFP, request for proposals, for CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, kind of in direct response to you know, how COVID-19 has not only highlighted, but exacerbated a lot of racial inequities in the United States. And so we are, you know, we're funding general operating support for all these CDFIs to kind of target these underrepresented or marginalized communities around the country. And I think that a lot of, and besides that, so that's, you know, the big RFP for general operating support grants. Aside from that, like our existing grantees, even grants that we've already given, we were kind of like, okay, like, what do you need, right? Like, we don't necessarily need you to run this program or like to fund this program. Like, what do you need to kind of withstand COVID-19's effects and, you know, get on the other end of it? And so I think that there is a big, there's a big drive. At least there's a lot of thought now around general operating support and how those grants might be even preferred, or might be even like the better type. I mean, obviously depending on where you're coming from and what you're doing, but you know, in my experience, at least, I think general operating support is 100% the way to go, especially in an environment, in a situation like the one we are in today.
I love this conversation because I think it speaks to pivoting, you know, and how quickly can organizations pivot to reflect the current times and demand. You know, I think as a country, our institutions have not demonstrated an ability to do that well. So it's interesting to see, you know, what kind of influence we can have at this level to get people to move faster, you know. Anyway, love it, yeah.
And there's a difference between just clicking a like button on Facebook, like, hey, I like this BLM post, you know, so I support Black Lives, versus actual making real change, which is to institute real policies, you know, or I think a theme that was being said was to kind of make things equitable, make fair resources, such as whether that's money or whether that's actually in the top level executive positions, having people of color, having more diversity. So we're gonna go ahead and go to the next question. What steps does your organization take to consider diversity in its approach?
I'm going to, if you don't mind, I can take a lead on this because I feel like mine is the shortest. Listening to you all talk can't help, and by the way, these are my own words, can't help but think about Robin Hood as historically being the stereotypical type of foundation that honestly likely contributes more to the nonprofit inequities that Lenny has spoken about. There was a really well done research paper by Echoing Green and Bridgespan. Echoing Green is ran by this Black woman named Cheryl Dorsey. And some of the numbers are just astounding when it comes to nonprofits led by leaders of color in general, specifically women and non-POCs, mainly white men. I think one of them was like Black-led orgs are 24% smaller when it comes to just basics like revenue. They receive 76% less percentage-wise in unrestricted funding, essentially general operating support that Lenny is talking about. And the arc is going backwards. That same paper talked about how organizations like Robin Hood have, when they were supporting, they've actually gone backwards when it comes to the proportion of their grants going towards POC-led organizations. And they've even halved at years, at points between 2010, the decades, and then 2000, they've halved their support for women of color-led organizations. So when I heard Robin Hood come out with something called the Power Fund, for some of you who may not have heard, but just like any other organization, this time was used to create a new fund, and part of that was diversifying our grantee roles, but also internally, part of that was to diversify. So for me, a lot of this is still lip service. That's my reality. The benefit I have working at my organization is we are led actually by predominantly Black and brown people. The CEO is a Black man. The COO, my direct boss, is a Black man. Our HR team is all POCs, including our HR managers. So our hiring practices have adjusted, they have changed. But even the CEO of an organization is still, and he has said this in ways, they feel like they're walking on eggshells. And I think that speaks volumes to the fact that even though we have a Black CEO, we still got to be careful about when we push for diversity and how, as if the fact that diversity alone as a concept isn't good enough, that we have to prove why this is important. So connecting to, you know, your question about what steps we're taking, we're trying to diversify our board, we're trying to diversify our ranks, which are easier, our hiring decisions, but we're still meeting a lot. And the majority of those steps are around hiring with more intent, specifically around lived experience, and hiring across economic spectrums. The majority of Robin Hood pre-2012 was 90% white. And if you looked at the economic class of the majority of the staff, none of them had experienced poverty. I think it was 100% of them were considered middle to high income individuals. And so to me, that also speaks volumes about who is tackling the concept of, in this case, reducing poverty in New York City when they've never experienced poverty. And so although we're changing our hiring practices and doing this, I still think we have a long way to go as an organization.
Yeah, for sure. Just to piggyback off of that, I agree. I think there is still a long way to go. I think we have a unique double challenge in the sense that we are owned by our corporation, right? Like Citi pays my checks, like the Citi Foundation doesn't. Citi Foundation is a separate legal entity. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, but I'm an employee of Citigroup. I'm paid by Citigroup. I get all my benefit and everything like that through Citigroup. And so relatedly, I went through hiring. I went through the interview process with Citigroup. I went with the corporate HR. And so there's a lot just in that, right? Just in that process, there's a lot that a lot of people would need to overcome in terms of challenges and unknown experiences, right? Not everybody knows how to interview with a large multinational corporation, right? Not everyone knows, the etiquette, the proper way of doing things, quote unquote. And aside from that, on the internal side, we are beholden to HR. We are beholden to Citigroup's human resources department in terms of who we can hire, what requirements we have for the job descriptions, what the salary ranges, everything like that is, right? And so it's interesting to kind of have to reckon with that. But also I will say that I don't know if people have really pushed back on that the way they should have been, even in the past couple of years, right? I've been here for 3.5 years now, maybe. And I don't, like we're still hiring people with master's degrees, right? And with all of the background that kind of necessitates. And so that's really common. I would say one of the biggest things that we're doing right now is the formation of these DEI working groups. So like I was saying before, there's a foundation specific DEI working group. And then there's a DEI working group kind of across all functions. So the function is, just to give you guys all a bit of a quick background, it's the president of the foundation is the head of this function. And so the function includes the foundation, but it also includes community relations. They're essentially the same thing. They give money to nonprofits only in America though, whereas the foundation is global, and an impact investing group. So that's, doing impact investing essentially, right? Very new. But the DEI working groups would be the biggest thing I would say. I mean, I think there is a passion for it, but I think with this kind of work, there's always a passion for it, right? There's, especially right now, it's in style, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion are in style right now. Like everybody wants to talk about it. Everybody wants to say what they're doing for it. Everybody wants to throw up their, pictures of like their teams, all the black and brown people on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, actually sitting down and doing the work is something that's a lot more challenging, right? I think it includes, maybe rethinking these, especially at a corporation like this, these hierarchical caste-like power structures, right? The higher up the ladder you climb, the more power you have. And conversely, the lower on the ladder you have, the less power you have, right? Like you don't have it. People at the very bottom don't have any kind of decision-making power, don't kind of have any flexibility to kind of like go out on their own and like, do something, right? And so I think that there are a couple of things. I mean, like we do ask on our grant applications. Again, these are not open applications. So we already do kind of have an idea of who we're partnering with in terms of nonprofit grantees, but we'll ask them about their leadership. We'll ask them, how diverse is your leadership? Are they diverse at all, right? We are working right now on a new section to our application, a DEI section. So that is going to be digging in a little bit deeper. What is your board makeup and composition? What is your senior staff? What is the whole organization? What about the communities that you want to serve or that you are serving, right? What is their makeup? And we're trying to go, right now we're kind of in a discussion, because I think DEI at the end of the day is very broad, right? Like I was saying earlier, diversity is anything and everything. Yes, it's race, yes, it's gender, yes, it's sexuality, but it's also age. It's also, are you able-bodied versus, not so much? Are you, what religion are you? Where are you from in the United States? Are you a foreign, like there's so many different components and aspects to DEI. And I think right now we're going to end up focusing on racial equity specifically. Because I mean, I think at the end of the day, especially in America, that's at the root of everything, right? It's really this white supremacist culture, society that really, puts white people on top and black people on the bottom. And then depending on what you're talking about, there are other people of color in between that are kind of moving up and down. But I think at the end of the day, that is really the core issue. And so that is what we're going to end up focusing on. But besides that, like that question on the application, I know our impact investing fund is preferring companies that are led by people of color and everything, but I'm a person of color, right? And if you're looking at me, it's like, are you like, yeah, I'm kind of like ambiguous or whatever, but I present as white, right? And so moving through society, I've had white privilege conferred on me. So even me being at the head of an organization saying, this organization is led by a person of color, it's like, yes, technically it is, but you know, it's going back to that lived experiences kind of thing, right? Like do I have a lived experience as somebody with even like a skin 1 or 2, you know, shades darker than me, right? It's really, it's an interesting topic, but I will say that I think there is a lot of buy-in from the top. In terms of our board, I don't think there is a lot we can do because again, those are all executives within the organization, within the company, and they're, you know, they're rich and white. So, you know, that's probably going to stay the same for a while. But I know that there are other companies that aren't like that. Like for example, Estee Lauder, their foundation, I don't think any of their board works at Estee Lauder. I think that's a really great way to be able to increase diversity or promote diversity, right, on your board. But other than that, I mean, I think similar to what Razak said, yeah, we still have a long way to go for sure.
So this is a good transition actually, because we want to talk about you know, how philanthropic organizations are looking at diversity, but also perhaps how your organizations, those of you who are on the call with us today, how they're approaching diversity as well. So we have another poll, which I'm going to launch now. And I also, as you are answering the poll, want to encourage you and remind you to put your questions in the chat. We're approaching the last 30 minutes of our allotted time for this, and we want to prioritize your questions. We have a couple of more in the chamber. If you want to continue hearing us ask our questions, but let us know which ones you have as well.
While we're waiting for the poll, Lenny, it really struck me what you said, you know, having white privilege conferred on you. And I think for me, you know, being Asian, but being a dark-skinned Asian, there's all that negative connotation of, oh, you're not like Chinese or light-skinned, you're like a Pacific Islander. And it's just that weird, like, I guess, bias that comes with people of dark skin, even though I am Taiwanese. But yeah, it's a different experience. I know that certain people don't look as highly, especially when I work with clients that are from East Asia. I can tell that they don't look highly upon me because my skin is a little darker. Sometimes they ask me if I fell asleep in the sun, so it's kind of weird.
That's wild. But I mean, it's so true. I mean, skin lightening products are like all the rage in Southern Asia and Eastern Asia. I mean, colorism is what, like a child of racism, right? I mean, I think it can be absolutely devastating, especially in the Latino community. I mean, like, you know, there's tons of colorism, and it really does affect how people think of you, treat you, talk to you. You know, you know, people want to find a desirable mate, and that's all. Desirable always means white. Wherever you are in the world, desirable for some reason always means white or light, right? And it's absolutely just.
Yeah. There was a short review I read of the show. I have not watched it. Yeah, there you go, Indian Matchmaking, where they kept using the term fair skin. And I mean, the review wasn't too critical, but it just essentially clarified what you and Maggie just experienced in different ways, but spoke about, and a lot of other people do, that, you know, that was a missed opportunity. But yeah, Indian matchmaking was what I was thinking about, Maggie. Glad we were on the same page.
And Jamila, you want to share the results from the poll?
You know, I did share them and I thought you could see them. I'll just say what the answers are. Does your workplace have a paid position for diversity and inclusion? 6 of you, or 32%, said yes. 12 said no, 63%. And 1 person doesn't know, which in and of itself could be concerning, you know what I mean? So those are the answers. The majority of people don't have a D&I person on staff.
That's kind of shocking. Okay, let's go into the questions and answer session from the audience, unless you want the moderators to ask the questions, but please let us know if you have any questions, type it in the chat, and we can ask the panelists. Or you can also put up a little emoji and we can call on you and meet you.
So while you're there, we thought that it would be good to have a conversation about moving from performative to sustainable support for diversity in the workplace. So we wanted to ask the question of our panelists: what are some of the challenges that people of color or other minority groups face in your workplace? And perhaps in the philanthropic industry in general.
I will say, and this is something I was having a conversation with a colleague about, and I would say one of the things is advocating for yourself, right? I think a lot of us, especially in philanthropy, are really good at advocating for others and have a lot of experience with that. But I think when it comes to yourself, there's a tendency to not be as assertive or not be as strong-willed about it. And I think that that's a unique challenge that I think we all, across the spectrum, right, that everyone I think needs to get comfortable with and needs to get better at, regardless of where you're starting off from, because I think advocacy, right, always begins with yourself, kind of like DEI also, right? Like addressing all these issues, thinking about all these issues, it always has to start with yourself. What am I doing to uphold white supremacy? What am I doing to, whatever it is? And I think that one of the biggest challenges is always advocating for yourself. And I think especially, depending on what work environment you're in, I think it can be really, really challenging, especially if you're looking up and you don't see anybody that looks like you or talks like you or thinks like you. And I think that it's really important to begin to think of yourself as an individual that deserves to be advocated for and that should be advocated for, especially in an organization like this, especially professionally.
Ladies, I'm really curious what your thinking is around this question. Liz, you're in a male-dominated organization, and Maggie, I wonder what kind of biases there are in the international development arena. So if you all wouldn't mind weighing in, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Remember how we talk?
That's because we did it on the smartphone.
No, we've had webcams where we just use it.
I mean, I can jump in. I have a lot of, mixed feelings about it, as we were talking about this diversity and inclusion role. And for me, when this work is separated as a separate body, as a separate entity, it takes ownership. It takes the onus of the work away from the organization, from the executive leadership. It's like that diversity thing, it sits with that person over there. It's not something that I need to think about, I need to implement, or I need to look at our work in a different manner. So I go back and forth about how do you equip your organization in a way to have a racial equity and inclusion lens, but also how do you prevent it from being isolated into a separate body of work versus being embedded into the entire work and operations of the organization. You would think working for an all-male union that there would be, traditional issues around like misogyny and suppression of women's voices, but contrary to that, our basketball players, their foundations, they're predominantly headed by women of color. Actually, there are so many women who play key roles in our basketball players' lives. Whether it is, you can look at LeBron James, you can look at Chris Paul, you can look at D Wade. I'm just throwing out the marquee players right there. The heads of their foundations are women and women of color. So it is a unique space, I'd say, when it comes to the voices of women. I wouldn't necessarily see that as a challenging space within the union and the foundation where I work. But when it comes to issues surrounding sexual orientation, that is something that may pose challenges and whatnot as we're working towards having a more equitable society. And of course, that just dates back to like cisgender men existing as the entire league. And I think in the history of the NBA, there's only been one basketball player who has publicly identified as identifying as an LGBTQ individual. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah, so I can definitely jump in here. One thing that I'm saying we as like people of color in the workplace advocate for ourselves. One of the things that I've been told as one of the co-leaders of the Asian and Pacific Islander group is that thank you so much for creating the space for us to like speak up, find our tribe. Because a lot of times, like, you're just like, is this an isolated incident? You know, when something weird happens in the office, you're like, is it me? Is this weird? And it's just finding that person to talk to or that group of people, that core group that have your shared experience. So like finding an affinity group to really be with and using that as a platform. Because now as we see, you know, it's in vogue to talk about racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion. And now what's interesting that I'm seeing at UNF is that we have these affinity groups, we have DEI that is our umbrella for it. We were always an extracurricular activity. No one paid us any mind. We were under the culture committee, which decides where the holiday party is and what food is being served. And that's how low DEI is. But now, all of a sudden, we're elevated to a different space. We've come out of culture committee. Every affinity group has a seat at the table, a rotating seat to talk to our CEO, CFO, COO. And in fact, just last week, they created an advisory board of these power holding individuals in our organization to basically have a seat as well. So it's not just us advocating for ourselves, it's for the people in power to share that power and give the space and the power to us. So it's a two-way street to me. And I think going back to what Lenny said about sustainability and really changing the space and diversity we are in, one of the main things that I think is most important for us to get through is that when you hire interns, there should be no more unpaid internships, because I think that that is the core of inequity. You know, even when I was an intern, first of all, you're taking my skills that I've worked hard and paid for through school, through opportunities, through part-time jobs for free. So you're undervaluing me from the get-go. And then I go to school full-time and I work part-time, and all the time that I'm giving to you for free, and also I'm paying for my own transportation. So I'm paying to work for you. I don't get as much of an opportunity to, you know, pay for my bills or pay for tuition. And this is something that if we want to see a change in our philanthropy space, we need to start from the beginning. We need to recruit the people that we want to see move up into management, move up into leadership, and bring them in when they're really young. And I think that's the first easiest way for people to just be like, knock that out. No unpaid internships, so everyone has a chance to do it.
I would just comment one thing on what you just said, Maggie. I mean, for the most part, retweet, and that is an endorsement, okay, first of all. But I would say, yes, for sure, expanding and diversifying pipelines, super, super, super important. And I think you also need to come in with an understanding of where these expanded and diversified pipelines, the people that you're getting through them are coming from, right? They're not gonna be able to do an unpaid internship. They're not gonna be, you know, like they might have other things, you know, if you wanna hire single moms or single parents or whatever it is, right? Like you'll need to go above and beyond in today's world to kind of be able to accommodate them, right? Or set them up for their biggest success, right? Absolutely, unpaid internships are exclusionary, 100%. But I would kind of push back on this idea of leadership having to come up through an organization. I know for me personally, and this is, right, like this is a safe space, right? Kind of confidential, whatever. my raises at the end of every year are like glorified cost of living adjustments. And I know that that is the same across industries, across companies, across geographies, right? And so I think that a reality that we are setting into is that there aren't going to be people at organizations, at companies for 5, 10, 15, 20 years anymore. I just don't think that's going to be a reality of the new normal. And so I would say that is just another opportunity for you to expand and diversify also C-suite and executive level pipelines as well, right? Because I think especially at those levels, there's such a small pool of qualified candidates, right? And qualified is in air quotes because I know I'm sure we're all familiar with, the fact that white people tend not to need to be as qualified as Black people. I mean, especially I was reading, I don't know if it was the same article that Razak brought up earlier, but heads of nonprofits, Black and brown people tend to be super overly qualified, whereas white people are kind of just like barely hitting it. And so I think that the need for C-suite, for executive level pipelines to expand and to diversify are. Hello?
We can hear
sorry. We can hear you, yeah. I think it's going to be more and more and more important, right? As people are leaving, as people are going from job to job, from company to company, I think that we're going to need to really take a look at, especially like headhunters and, people like that who are trying to hire for a CFO, right? Or a COO or an executive director or whatever it is, and not just go to the tried and true, like, little cabal of white people that are doing this thing, right? It's going to be expanding, diversifying, seeing what else is out there and how you can bring those people in too, right? And how you can accommodate, but also support all of these fresh and new perspectives and experiences that they are also bringing to the table. Exactly. Beyond Ivy Leagues, beyond big name schools, beyond all of these institutions that kind of command or just exude this kind of like legitimacy, I would say. I mean, I think there are so many other ways for a person to become qualified and successful in an ED role or a CFO role or a COO role that is not just going to, Columbia Business School or something, you know what I mean? And so I think that it's looking at all levels and then seeing what you can do at each level. And I think expanding and diversifying these pipelines is one of the things that that's kind of, level agnostic. So like, it doesn't matter what level it is, there are these pipelines that are set right now, especially at a place like Citigroup, right? And so most of what I'm saying is, obviously coming from my experience at a big corporation, but for us, I know that there are pipelines already. Like, I think one of the biggest things that we did as a working group was just post these roles, like new roles that were opening up on, like, we reached out to HBCUs, we reached out to our affinity networks, we reached out to all these non-profit professional organizations that dealt with people of color exclusively, right? Black people, brown people, reaching these people where they are, not waiting or expecting them to come to us, but really reaching out that olive branch kind of, I guess, right? That connection, right? Is really just starting because we have the resources to do that. They may not necessarily have them.
Thanks for sharing, y'all. A question came through. When we talk about white supremacy and dismantling it, what does it mean to eradicate proximity to whiteness as a standard? And what does success then look like when addressing social issues?
Can you post that into the message?
I will say, kind of just really quickly reading it, proximity to whiteness is defined by a couple of different things, but usually, mainly, it's about money. And so I think when you become successful and you're rich, essentially, that's very white adjacent, right? And because money opens up a lot of opportunities for you that may not necessarily have been open. For example, gated communities, right? Or these private schools, right? Or like Ivy League educations, right? I think that as you get more and more money, more like wealthier and wealthier, I think you become more and more adjacent to whiteness. I don't think, especially for Black people, I don't think you'll ever be treated or have white privilege. I mean, there was that study done where at essentially any income bracket, Black people are way more likely to fall from whatever income bracket they started out at to become even poor, to lose wealth, right? Same thing with police, law enforcement, and the courts. You're going to be treated worse off no matter what your background, no matter what your socioeconomic status. But I think in a lot of cases, it's wealth is what I would say would be the indicator for white adjacency, I think. So success.
Cultural, a cultural identity, I think, plays into that. Maggie, I'm kind of curious what you think about this, especially because your organization presumably has people from lots of different backgrounds and experiences. And as Peace Corps volunteers, we've all had to kind of move out of our comfort zone and open up to a different cultural identity. What do you think about proximity to whiteness in that context, in the international development context?
I think it's very unique because United Nations Foundation works with clients all over the world. And a lot of times, even when we talk about racism, colorism, you're looking at them in their individual bubbles or little dance circles, right? What we define as racist, other people don't define as racist. What we see as a standard of high class, like here, oddly enough, you know, getting a tan means that you went on vacation. So that's a measure of status. But in an Asian country, for example, staying white is your measure of status. And I think one of the things that we really need to be aware of, the proximity to whiteness in the way I define it is just, as Lenny said, the connection to rich people, wealthy families, they're all part of the same group. They're not saying anything different. You know, you can have a couple white women at the top at a corporation, but they're making the same decisions. They're not going to shake it up and change the status quo. I think what's really unique about our situation or about circumstances now is that we're in a space where, especially young people, and I say young people because I work with young people at Girl Up, Gen Zers they grew up in the digital age, and in a lot of ways, they've been exposed to a lot of things that I wasn't exposed to when I was young. And I find that their reasoning and their ideas about sustainability and climate change are very much like very Peace Corps-esque. And they are, you know, essentially the future. And when we look at consumerism in our society, they're going for brands that do good in the world. So right now, I think that there's just this huge opportunity to make that change. And one of the ways is not just going for Carnegie or Ford or Rockefeller for these like major money donations. You know, they're always the quote unquote tried and true. And I think now is the time for us to really topple that. Tried and true doesn't mean always the best. There are a lot of philanthropies started by people of color that just need that initial investment. Because once we do make those investments or make arguments for people to make that investment to them, we bring them up and give them the time to shine. And from there, they can really build their brand, build their philanthropy, and be the next Rockefeller Ford Foundation, if that's even what we want to use as a comparison. So I think right now we're in a ripe space where people are smarter about where they put their money, and there's enough social activism from young people to make that influence.
I love that. And that's actually a perfect segue, you know, talking about how we elevate voices and empower people to make change. One of the questions in the chat was, what can individuals do to contribute to diversity and inclusion in their own organizations? What kind of advice do you have for people who are trying to get their voices heard?
One of the things I did was just talk to colleagues.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Right? Yeah, so just talk to other employees that you know have a vested interest in this as well, because I think, again, there's a lot of passion for it, right? Like I think especially right now, there's a lot of interest in it, but saying you're doing the work is one thing, and then actually doing the work is another, and doing the work is hard. Right? You're gonna be uncomfortable. You're gonna get out of your safe space. You're gonna, you know, have to talk to, but really assert yourself to people who can make these changes, which is usually rich white men at the top, right? Or rich white women at the top, or, you know, whoever it is at the top. And you're not only gonna need to approach them and assert these positions, but convince them of them, right? And so I think even I've run into a little bit too, is that some employees aren't super comfortable doing that, right? So, some employees don't want to rock the boat too much, or, you know, and of course everybody has a different situation. Everybody's job security is different. Everybody, you know, everybody is coming from a different place. So it's hard, but I would say, first of all, safety numbers, right? And I think especially among the younger generation, so people that tend to be lower on the ladder, I think there is not only a passion for this, but an interest in doing it, a vested interest in doing it. And I think that is one of the main ways in which you're going to be able to affect any kind of change, is not only asserting yourself to senior management, but showing them how widespread the need and the interest for this actually is. And then start out doing things without the blessing of senior management, right? So one of the things we did, again, putting those job postings on websites or with organizations that they weren't going to before, right? That's a very minor thing. Whenever, I mean, with us, so I can only imagine it would be the same with everyone else. Like whenever there's a new job or whatever, they'll send it out and they'll say, please share with your networks, right? They don't have to be with your networks, right? I didn't go to an HBCU. I have no problem blasting it out to them. I have no problem blasting it out to professional organizations like MLT or other ones that serve Black and Brown communities, regardless of whether or not you're a part of them, you know, to get the word out. Because I think especially with a lot of the populations that you're wanting to attract, they may not necessarily have the same pipelines. I mean, now it's kind of easy because everything's on LinkedIn, or everything kind of eventually makes its way to LinkedIn. But, you know, just taking that extra step and going beyond what's happening, I think is also just really important to show to senior management that you're invested in this work. Because I think going back to, I think Liz was saying this earlier, it's hard when an organization has D&I or DEI with one person. If there's a head of DEI, there's a chief diversity officer, if there's a DEI, whatever you want to call it. I was reading this article where this writer interviewed like lots of people that had these kinds of positions. And, you know, they were always running up against this white wall of white fragility. I don't know if you guys know the book by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, but it's a problem, right? It's a problem, it's an issue. And sooner or later, the people that have been kind of saddled with this responsibility, I'm sure they're, you know, subject matter experts in it. I'm sure they have a passion for it. But at the end of the day, if you can't, or if the people in power can't meet you where you are, or can't, you know, open up a space where you can share these initiatives and decide to take action based upon all of this, then it's kind of, you know, so I think it's always, the way we did it too is this working group, it's kind of spread across the function, right? So it's not, you can't really block one employee from doing this, right? You can't really like sideline one specific person from doing this, or neglect one specific person, because it's so integrated and it's so widespread. I think it's more effective for sure than having one person. Of course, every organization is different. And I think one of the first things you have to do is kind of take temperature, right? See kind of what the appetite is at the top, and then see who else is interested on your level or like in other levels around you, right? To kind of build this kind of grassroots momentum before wanting to affect any kind of change organization-wide or policy-wide, I would say.
What do you think about this one?
I'm sorry. I haven't had a great connection. I think you might have said my name.
I did.
Okay, got it.
I was
My
curious
bad.
about your answers.
I mean, these types of questions are extremely hard for me to even wrap my head around. And I have to say that because the messenger is extremely important. And I think Lenny hinted at that at the very end about essentially what you're describing as a groundswell of support internally. And I think it's hard, you know, just to what Gina kind of uplift what Gina just mentioned in the chat. It is about self-education, but honestly, the messenger is the most important thing I've experienced at work. And I think it's fair to say that if it is a woman of color saying something, it's likely not going to get heard. Historically, it has not. And it needs to be, unfortunately, to this day, it needs to be someone who is white passing, or more importantly, a white male, or even a black male, to repeat something that has been said 1,000 times over. I think the majority of the issues we are discussing, we touched upon today, there are solutions for them. The problem is we need more people to get behind it. And for me, that is that is what I've been struggling with. The limit of empathy is what it's called, right? The reason that Martin Luther King, John Lewis, the reason those people got their asses kicked and wanted to make sure it was recorded was because they knew they could build empathy. You know, I think one of the main reasons why there's a huge push right now for social change has to do with more white kids, honestly, getting their asses kicked in Portland and in Chicago. That's the reality. That's how I see it, at least. If it was more Black and brown people, I do not think it would be on the TV, especially in this relatively empathetic manner that they show it on CNNs of the world. So connecting that to work, for me, I need more white people to be as brave as Lenny, as brave as myself, as brave as Maggie speaking up, as brave as Liz whenever she needs to, right? Like, we need more people, because no matter what, it's going to be hard if you, especially if you're a woman of color, trying to make change, specifically if you're a Black woman, about diversity in the workplace. I see that with one of the most powerful people in the office and at Robinhood, and they are HR managers and COOs and CEOs. And white fragility stopped a book club last summer, right? A book club. We couldn't get a book club about race through, right? And so if we can't do that, that's the CEO trying to push a book club. But coincidentally, he's a Black man. So when some of our white colleagues started getting behind this, what a coincidence. You start seeing more interest in this. And so for me, it has to go down to who the messenger is. And if that messenger is part of the group in quote unquote power, it's going to be an easier pill to swallow for those decision makers.
Yeah, I totally like what Razak said about the power sharing, like people in power bringing it back to us and giving us the space. But I think also a way for everyone to always be involved. It's not always just people of color or white people, it's everyone. And I think that one of the ways, going back to the question, one of the ways that my workplace has really changed it for us is that, again, taking affinity groups from extracurricular to core curriculum. And we advocated to have affinity groups as part of the onboarding packet for all new employees. So whether you're an intern or an employee, you will read through affinity groups, and we encourage you to choose one. So everyone has an identity. Whatever you are, you have an identity. You will participate in, supporting and creating the space for your identity. And I think this is really a way for people, all people, to know what it's like to defend a piece of who you are. And I think that really generates a sense of, empathy for other people as they are fighting for who they are as well in any space. So taking it from the extracurricular and making it important. And I think, like Razak, you're right, it takes people in power, and usually they're white, but they got to be there. They have to make the space with us. It's like holding hands. I'm thinking about that movie, Us, the hand holding dolls, the paper cuts, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add, everybody just had phenomenal comments, but I think overall, I think it's so critical to push your organization to be a learning organization, and recognizing that there is ignorance, there is a lack of understanding, and how you as a person, you bring your perspective just by you being there, and the channels that you're connected to, what you're seeing, what you're reading, that brings so much value to the workplace. And even if you aren't at that right level of power or proximity, you sharing what it is that there may be an ally that Shannon is speaking to, or there may be somebody who wants to sponsor that concept and move that work forward. Funny enough, when I was working at Peace Corps, when I was in the former administration, just the notion of how do we engage with more people of color to become interested in the Peace Corps. And it was like, nobody had ever heard of travel noir before, or heard of like Nomadness Travel, or had heard of these outlets that people of color were clinging to expose themselves to travel into various cultures. And it's just like, by nature of being a person of color in this environment, and just regularly being exposed to that, and recognizing that there may be ignorance surrounding you, not a lack of wanting to move in that direction, or push towards more equity or understanding, but like, real talk, just ignorance. And just continuing to push ourselves, to push our organizations to be learning organizations, and recognizing that great ideas and value can come from all echelons of the organization.
Thank y'all so. Oh, go ahead, Razak.
I'm sorry, thank you. If I may add, just to kind of hit on some of the chat themes, I really think that when it comes to white allyship and being an accomplice, the most important thing I've experienced that has worked, and I'd love to hear anyone else's opinions who work in an office and have been pushing for any type of diversity related change or anything around equity. I've noticed the best types of allies and accomplices are the ones who just make sure there's space for the person to speak. Essentially, be that sounding board, and be that person who supports it. And I want to connect this to my personal journey around masculinity in the workplace and how I show up as a cis straight man. I still have some power over women in the workplace. I've noticed that, and I think that, especially when it comes to conversations and stuff. So for me, that personal journey had to start with learning to just listen, but also promote. Don't doubt, because likely when a coworker, in my case, a woman coworker, says something about an issue, there's a 99.99% chance they are right, whether I can't comprehend it or not. And so my approach has helped me with that. And I say this because the biggest challenges I've had in the workplace, either around masculinity or around how the other ways I show up, are people doubting someone else's experience. And I think once we begin to do that, it's a dangerous game of taking away those identities that they show. And so kind of connecting to being an ally, trust is the number one thing, because likely whomever that person is, they're right. And the best thing I've learned to do is be a sounding board for those situations. Whether I understand an issue or not, I'm a sounding board. It's easy for me to take back support if there was a mistake I made. It is hard for me to give support when I doubted someone in the first place.
Well said, Razak. Thank you so much for sharing. It's definitely important for all of us to be an ally and try to make a seat at the table for people of color. And speaking of power, I hope that we all feel empowered after this conversation. We've definitely gained some more information, tools, and techniques in order to try to help promote more people of color, a more equitable situation for more people of color. And hopefully everyone does understand by the end of this conversation why it's so important that diversity be celebrated and be highlighted, especially in speaking about philanthropy. It's 6:33, we're a little bit over time, but it was definitely worth it. Thank you so much, Lenny, Razak, Maggie, and Liz for coming on tonight. Thank you so much for opening up. It was a real and honest conversation, and I definitely know that I learned a lot, and I appreciate y'all so much. And Jamila, do you have anything to say?
I don't, just I want to add my thanks as well.
Thank you both so much for hosting.
Thank y'all. Shout out to the participants for coming on. Y'all have a wonderful Tuesday night. Take care.
Bye.